The turkey was still warm when my daughter Ashley walked out of my house with her entire family, leaving me to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone at a table set for 12. What she didn't know was that I'd been secretly funding her lavish lifestyle for 3 years, and by the time I finished my slice of pumpkin pie in that empty dining room, I'd already decided to cut off every single penny. But that was just the beginning of what would become the most devastating financial lesson I've ever taught anyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Phyllis Turner, and until this past Thanksgiving, I thought the worst thing about getting older was watching your body slow down. I was wrong. The worst thing is discovering that the child you raised, the one you sacrificed everything for, sees you as nothing more than a convenient servant who happens to have a checkbook. I should have seen it coming months earlier when Ashley first suggested I host Thanksgiving at my place in Millbrook, instead of her usual elaborate spread in the city. She'd called me on a Tuesday evening in late September, her voice bright with that particular enthusiasm she reserved for when she wanted something expensive. She told me how wonderful it would be to have a traditional family gathering at grandmother's house, how the kids needed to experience real home cooking instead of catered meals. At the time, I felt flattered. After years of being treated like an afterthought at her perfectly orchestrated holiday events, the idea of having my family gathered around my own dining room table felt like a gift. I should have questioned why she suddenly wanted to downsize from her usual production, why she was so eager to hand over the hosting duties she'd always guarded so jealously. But I was lonely. Howard had been gone for 2 years, and the holidays had become these hollow exercises in pretending I was fine. Ashley's invitation felt like a bridge back to the family I'd been slowly losing since I became a widow. So I said yes immediately, probably too quickly, because I heard this little pause on her end before she launched into a detailed list of everything she expected me to prepare. The menu she rattled off wasn't a suggestion, it was a command performance. She wanted my famous herb-crusted turkey, the stuffing recipe that had been in Howard's family for generations, homemade cranberry sauce, 3 different types of potatoes, green bean casserole made from scratch, fresh dinner rolls, and at least 4 different desserts. When I mentioned that seemed like a lot of work for one person, she laughed and said I'd always been such a perfectionist in the kitchen that this was my chance to really show off. I spent the next 2 months planning that dinner like it was a military operation. I researched new recipes, ordered specialty ingredients online, and even bought a second oven to make sure everything would be perfect. I had my carpets professionally cleaned, hired someone to wash the windows, and spent a small fortune on new linens and centerpieces because I wanted Ashley to be proud of what I'd created. What I didn't realize until much later was that Ashley had been planning something entirely different. While I was obsessing over whether to use sage or rosemary in the stuffing, she was orchestrating what would turn out to be the most humiliating experience of my life. The first sign something was wrong came 3 days before Thanksgiving when Ashley called to tell me there had been a slight change of plans. Instead of the intimate family dinner we'd discussed, she'd invited her husband Derek's entire extended family, plus several of their friends from the country club. What had started as a gathering for 8 had somehow ballooned into a party for 15 people. She delivered this news like it was a minor detail, barely worth mentioning. When I pointed out that I'd only bought enough food for our immediate family, she assured me that everyone would understand if the portions were a little smaller. She said it would be more fun with a bigger crowd, more festive, and that I shouldn't worry about impressing anyone because they were all very down to earth. I hung up the phone feeling panicked and overwhelmed, but I didn't have the nerve to tell her no. Instead, I made another trip to the grocery store, doubling my order and spending money I couldn't really afford on enough food to feed a small army. I told myself it would be worth it to see Ashley happy, to feel like I was contributing something meaningful to her life. The night before Thanksgiving, I barely slept. I was up until 3 in the morning prepping vegetables, making pie crusts, and setting up everything I could in advance. My back was aching from standing for so many hours, and my hands were raw from peeling potatoes, but I felt this strange sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of November weather that makes everything feel melancholy. I was in the kitchen by 6, sliding the turkey into the oven and starting on the endless list of side dishes that needed to be timed perfectly. The house filled with the warm, rich smells of the holidays, and for a few hours, I almost felt happy. Ashley and her family were supposed to arrive at noon to help with the final preparations, but noon came and went without any word. I called her cell phone twice and got voicemail both times. By 1 o'clock, I was starting to worry that something had happened, that there'd been an accident or an emergency. At 1:30, my phone finally rang. Ashley sounded rushed and slightly irritated when she told me they were running behind schedule, that Derek had insisted on stopping by his office to handle some urgent business matter. She said they'd be there as soon as possible, but that I should go ahead and start without them if I needed to keep things warm. I asked if she wanted me to push dinner back, and she said no, that would just complicate things for everyone else. She told me to have everything ready by 3 as planned, and they'd catch up when they arrived. The casual way she said it made my stomach clench, but I convinced myself she was just stressed about coordinating so many people. By 2:45, I had transformed my modest dining room into something that belonged in a magazine. The table was set with my good china and crystal. The centerpieces I'd agonized over looked elegant and welcoming, and every dish I'd prepared was arranged perfectly on warming trays in the kitchen. I'd even changed into the new dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, a deep burgundy wool that I thought would photograph well for the family pictures Ashley always insisted on taking. At 3 o'clock exactly, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the front window, I watched Ashley emerge from her black SUV looking polished and effortless in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. Derek followed behind her, checking his phone and looking vaguely annoyed about something. The rest of their party unloaded from 2 additional cars, a collection of people I'd met briefly at various events over the years, but didn't really know. They moved up my front walk in a cluster, talking and laughing among themselves, and I noticed that none of them were carrying anything. No flowers, no wine, no dessert to contribute. Ashley had apparently told them this was being fully catered by her mother. I opened the front door before they could knock, my face bright with the smile I'd been practicing all morning. Ashley swept in first, air-kissing my cheek and immediately handing me her coat like I was hired help. The others followed suit, creating a small mountain of expensive outerwear that I draped over the banister while they wandered into my living room without invitation. Ashley barely glanced at the dining room as she passed it, though I'd spent hours arranging everything exactly the way I thought she'd like it. Instead, she went straight to the bar cart in the corner and started mixing drinks for everyone, chatting about their morning golf game and some drama at the country club that had apparently consumed most of their drive over. I stood in my own foyer feeling oddly invisible while these people made themselves at home in my house. Derek had settled into Howard's old recliner and was scrolling through his phone, occasionally grunting responses to the conversations swirling around him. Ashley's 2 teenage kids, Madison and Connor, had disappeared upstairs without saying hello, and I could hear them moving around in what used to be Ashley's childhood bedroom. After about 20 minutes of this, I cleared my throat and announced the dinner was ready whenever they were. Ashley looked at me with mild surprise, as if she'd forgotten why they were there. She told everyone to finish their drinks first, that there was no rush, and launched into a story about someone's divorce that apparently required immediate discussion. I went back to the kitchen and checked on the food, trying to keep everything at the right temperature while I waited for them to decide they were ready to eat. The turkey was starting to dry out despite the foil tent I'd carefully constructed, and the green bean casserole was developing that slightly crusty edge that meant it had been warming too long. Finally, at nearly 4 o'clock, Ashley wandered into the kitchen and told me they were ready. But instead of helping me bring dishes to the table or organizing the serving process, she poured herself another glass of wine and stood watching, while I carried heavy platters back and forth by myself. When I asked if she could help me with the gravy boat, she sighed and said she didn't want to risk spilling anything on her dress. When I suggested that Derek or one of the other men might give me a hand, she shrugged and said they were all too busy catching up to be bothered with kitchen work. By the time I had everything on the table, I was exhausted and sweating despite the November chill. My carefully planned presentation looked slightly disheveled from all the trips back and forth, and I noticed that several people were already seated and reaching for bread rolls before I'd even finished setting down the last serving bowl. I took my place at the head of the table, the spot where Howard used to sit for 35 years of family dinners, and looked around at the faces of people who were already eating without waiting for any kind of blessing or acknowledgement of the effort that had gone into the meal. Ashley was sitting at the opposite end, perfectly positioned to hold court over the conversation, which had moved on to vacation plans and stock market discussions that didn't include me. Her friends complimented the food in passing, the way you might thank a waitress for bringing your order, but no one seemed particularly interested in where it had come from or how much work it had required. I tried to join the conversation several times, offering comments about the recipes or asking questions about their lives, but my contributions seemed to disappear into the general noise. After a while, I stopped trying and just focused on eating the meal I'd spent 3 days preparing. The dinner lasted almost 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity. People helped themselves to seconds and thirds without asking, finished entire bottles of wine I'd been saving for special occasions, and left their plates scattered across my dining room table like they were at a restaurant. When someone finally suggested it was time for dessert, I started to get up to clear the table, but Ashley held up her hand and told me to sit back down.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
She had an announcement to make, she said, something important that everyone needed to hear. My heart lifted slightly because I thought maybe she was going to thank me publicly for hosting or acknowledge the effort I'd put into making the day special. Instead, she stood up with her wine glass raised and told everyone that this had been such a success, she'd decided to make it an annual tradition. She said it was so much more authentic and meaningful than hiring caterers, that having family dinners at grandmother's house was exactly what her children needed to stay connected to their roots. She talked about the importance of tradition and family values while gesturing around my dining room like she was presenting a museum exhibit. Then she said something that made my blood turn cold. She announced that next year, she was thinking of expanding the guest list even more, maybe making it a weekend-long event, with people staying over, really turning it into the kind of family celebration that would become legendary. The way she said it, with that bright, planning tone in her voice, made it clear that she wasn't asking for my opinion, or even my permission. She was simply informing me that I'd just volunteered to host an even bigger production next year, that my house and my labor had now been permanently claimed for her entertainment purposes. Everyone raised their glasses and toasted the idea, while I sat there feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Ashley beamed around the table like she'd just solved world hunger instead of committing me to a year of dreading the holidays. After that, people started talking about leaving. They had other parties to attend, other family obligations to fulfill, and apparently my house had served its purpose as the appetizer to their real Thanksgiving plans. Ashley's friends began gathering their coats and making polite noises about what a lovely time they'd had. I expected Ashley to help me clear the table, or at least supervise the kids in cleaning up the enormous mess that had been made. Instead, she started putting on her coat too, thanking me for a wonderful day and saying they needed to get going to Derek's parents' house for their evening celebration. I must have looked confused because she explained that this had always been the plan, that they were doing Thanksgiving dinner with Derek's family at 5:30 and that they'd only had time for a quick lunch with me before their real dinner. She said it like this was information I should have already known, like I was being unreasonable for expecting them to stay longer. Madison and Connor appeared from upstairs carrying to-go containers they'd apparently found in my kitchen and were filling with leftovers. No one asked if this was okay. They just assumed that the food they'd barely touched during dinner was now theirs to take home. Derek was already in the car with the engine running, scrolling through his phone, and obviously impatient to leave. Ashley gave me another air kiss goodbye and told me the meal had been absolutely perfect, that I'd really outdone myself, and that she'd call me later in the week to start planning next year's menu. Then they were gone. All of them. I watched from my front window as 3 cars full of people drove away from my house, leaving me standing alone in my dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of what I'd thought was going to be a meaningful family celebration. The table looked like a hurricane had hit it. Plates were stacked haphazardly, with food still stuck to them. Wine glasses sat half full and stained with lipstick, and someone had spilled cranberry sauce on the white tablecloth I'd bought specifically for the occasion. The centerpieces I'd agonized over were wilted and pushed aside to make room for elbows and cell phones. I walked through the house, tallying the damage. The living room furniture was moved out of place. There were water rings on my coffee table from drinks that had been set down without coasters. and someone had used my guest bathroom without replacing the toilet paper. The kitchen looked like a bomb had gone off, with every pot and pan I owned dirty and stacked in the sink. But the worst part was the silence. After all the noise and chaos of the afternoon, the house felt more empty than it ever had. I sat down at my dining room table, still set with the good china I'd been so excited to use, and ate a piece of pumpkin pie by myself while looking at the empty chairs that surrounded me. That's when it hit me what had really happened. I hadn't hosted Thanksgiving dinner. I'd been used as free catering for Ashley's social obligations, a convenient way for her to check off the family time box before moving on to the celebrations that actually mattered to her. I thought about all the money I'd spent on food that was now sitting in someone else's refrigerator, about the 3 days I'd spent cooking for people who barely acknowledged my existence, about the way Ashley had volunteered me for next year without caring whether I wanted to do it again. But mostly I thought about how invisible I'd felt in my own home, how completely my daughter had dismissed me as a person worth considering. I'd been treated like hired help, except hired help gets paid and usually receives some basic courtesy. I sat there until it got dark outside, picking at my pie and feeling something harder than sadness settling in my chest. For the first time in years, I was genuinely angry. Not hurt, not disappointed, but furious at the way I'd allowed myself to be treated. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying moments from the dinner, remembering the casual way Ashley had ignored my attempts at conversation, the way her friends had treated my house like a public venue, the assumption that I would automatically agree to repeat this experience annually. But I also started thinking about other things, like the way Ashley always called when she needed money but rarely just to check how I was doing. The way she'd been borrowing increasingly large amounts over the past few years, always with promises to pay me back that never quite materialized. The way she'd moved into a house that seemed far beyond what Derek's insurance business should have been able to afford. I got up around 3 in the morning and went to my home office, pulling out the folder where I kept track of the loans I'd been making to Ashley's family. What I found when I added everything up made my hands shake. Over the past 3 years, I had given Ashley and Derek nearly $200,000. It had started small, with requests for help with Madison's private school tuition and Connor's lacrosse equipment. Then it escalated to car payments when Derek's business hit a rough patch, mortgage assistance when they'd overextended themselves buying the house, and most recently, a $50,000 loan to cover what Ashley called temporary cash flow problems. None of it had ever been repaid. Ashley always had reasons why this month wasn't good for paying me back, always promised that things would stabilize soon and she'd be able to start making regular payments. I'd believed her because I wanted to help, because I thought supporting my daughter's family was what good mothers were supposed to do. But sitting there in my office at 3 in the morning, surrounded by bank statements and canceled checks, I realized I hadn't been helping Ashley. I'd been enabling her to treat me like a personal ATM, while giving me nothing in return except increasingly elaborate ways to use my time and energy for her benefit. The Thanksgiving disaster had been the final proof I needed that Ashley saw me as a resource to be managed, not a person to be loved. And if that's how she wanted to play this relationship, then it was time for me to start managing my resources more carefully. I spent the rest of the night researching my options, and by the time the sun came up on Black Friday, I had a plan that would teach Ashley exactly how much her mother's support had really been worth. The first thing I did Friday morning was call my bank and request statements for every account I had, going back 5 years. I wanted documentation of every single transaction, every check I'd written to Ashley, every wire transfer I'd authorized. If I was going to dismantle the financial foundation I'd built under her lifestyle, I needed to understand exactly how deep the support structure went. While I waited for those records to arrive, I started making a list of everything I could remember giving Ashley money for over the years. The private school tuition that had supposedly been temporary until Derek's business picked up. The down payment assistance for their house in Westfield Heights that I'd never even been invited to see. The luxury car lease payments when Ashley decided she needed something more appropriate for her image. Each item I wrote down felt like another brick in a wall I'd been building without realizing it. Ashley hadn't gradually become financially dependent on me. I had systematically trained her to see my bank account as an extension of her own resources, available whenever she needed to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just about Thanksgiving, but about every time Ashley had called with a crisis that required immediate financial intervention. The way she always made these requests sound like emergencies, like I was the only thing standing between her family and complete disaster. I remembered the call 6 months ago when she'd been nearly in tears about Connor's summer lacrosse camp. She'd told me that all his teammates were going to this elite training program in Colorado, that he'd be devastated if he was the only one left behind, that it would affect his chances of getting into a good college. The camp cost $8,000, and Ashley swore she'd pay me back as soon as Derek closed a big insurance deal he'd been working on. Of course, Derek's big deal never materialized, or at least Ashley never mentioned it again. Connor went to his camp, posted dozens of photos on social media showing off his expensive equipment and mountain resort accommodations, and I never saw a penny of that money returned. The same pattern had repeated itself dozens of times. Madison needed money for a school trip to Europe. Derek's business required new equipment to stay competitive. Ashley herself needed funds for the social obligations that came with living in Westfield Heights, the charity events and country club memberships that she claimed were essential for Derek's networking. Every request had been framed as an investment in the family's future, a temporary loan that would ultimately benefit everyone. But I was starting to realize that Ashley had never intended to pay any of it back. She'd simply found a way to expand her family's income by including mine in their budget. By noon on Friday, I had a comprehensive picture of just how much of Ashley's life I'd been subsidizing. The private schools, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, the designer clothes, the expensive vacations they posted about constantly on social media. None of it would have been possible on Derek's actual income from his small insurance agency. I picked up the phone and called Derek's office, telling his secretary I needed to speak with him about a personal matter. When he came on the line, he sounded nervous, probably assuming I was calling to complain about how Thanksgiving had gone. Instead, I asked him a simple question about his business finances. I told him I was considering making some investments and wondered if he could give me a realistic assessment of what someone in his position typically earned annually. I kept my voice casual, like I was just gathering information for my own financial planning. Derek seemed relieved that I wasn't angry about something, and he was surprisingly candid about his income. What he told me confirmed my worst suspicions. Even in his best years, Derek's insurance agency generated barely enough to cover their basic living expenses. Everything else, all the luxury and status symbols that defined Ashley's lifestyle, had been coming from my account. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the calculator where I'd been running numbers. Ashley and Derek had been living like they made 3 times Derek's actual income, and I had been the silent partner funding the difference. They'd built their entire social identity around money that wasn't theirs, and they'd done it so gradually that I'd never seen the full scope of what was happening. But what made me angrier than the money itself was the realization that Ashley had never seen this as temporary help. She'd never had any intention of becoming financially independent again. She'd simply redefined her family's economic reality to include my resources as a permanent fixture. That afternoon, I drove to the law offices of Mitchell & Associates downtown. I'd looked them up online and chosen them specifically because they specialized in estate planning and family financial disputes. I needed professional advice about the legal implications of what I was planning to do. The attorney I met with, Sarah Mitchell, was probably 10 years younger than Ashley but carried herself with an authority that my daughter had never possessed. I explained my situation carefully, showing her the documentation I'd gathered about the loans and the pattern of dependency that had developed. Sarah listened without judgment, taking notes and asking pointed questions about whether any of the money had been formalized through loan agreements. When I admitted that everything had been handled informally, family-style handshake deals, she nodded like she'd seen this scenario many times before. She explained that since the money had been given as gifts, rather than formal loans, I had no legal recourse for getting it back. But she also confirmed that I had absolutely no legal obligation to continue providing financial support, regardless of how dependent Ashley had become on that income. More importantly, Sarah helped me understand the full scope of what cutting off Ashley's access to my money would actually mean. She walked me through the likely timeline of financial collapse, explaining how quickly someone living beyond their means would hit the wall once their hidden income source disappeared. Based on what I'd told her about Ashley's lifestyle and Derek's actual income, Sarah estimated that my daughter's family would start feeling the pressure within 30 days of being cut off. Within 90 days, they'd be facing serious choices about which luxuries to eliminate. Within 6 months, they'd likely be looking at bankruptcy or major downsizing. I asked Sarah if she thought I was being too harsh, if there was a middle ground that might teach Ashley a lesson without completely destroying her family's stability. Sarah looked at me with the kind of direct gaze that cut through all the emotional complexity of the situation. She told me that in her experience, people who had become financially dependent on family members rarely learned moderation through gradual adjustments. They simply found ways to stretch the reduced support further, while continuing to expect that more help would always be available when they needed it. If I wanted Ashley to understand the true value of what she'd been receiving, Sarah said, the only effective approach was complete withdrawal. Anything less would just be interpreted as temporary tightening that would eventually return to the previous level of support. I left Sarah's office with a clear legal framework for what I was planning to do, but also with a heavy heart about what it would mean for my relationship with Ashley. Even if my daughter deserved to face the consequences of her financial irresponsibility, I still loved her enough to feel sick about the pain she was about to experience. That evening, I called my sister Janet in Phoenix to talk through what I was considering. Janet had always been more practical than me when it came to money, and she'd never particularly liked Ashley's entitled attitude during family gatherings. When I explained what had happened at Thanksgiving and what I'd discovered about the financial situation, Janet was quiet for a long time before speaking. Finally, she said something that crystallized everything I'd been feeling. She told me that I'd been so focused on being a good mother that I'd forgotten to be a smart woman. That Ashley had learned to manipulate my maternal instincts to get what she wanted, and that every time I rescued her from financial consequences, I was actually preventing her from growing up. Janet reminded me of our own childhood, how our parents had struggled to make ends meet but had never asked their relatives for handouts. How we'd learned the value of money because we'd had to live within actual constraints, make real choices about what we could and couldn't afford. She pointed out that by shielding Ashley from those same constraints, I'd essentially raised her to be financially irresponsible. That my daughter had never learned to distinguish between needs and wants because she'd never had to choose between them. By the time I hung up with Janet, I knew what I had to do. Not just to punish Ashley for treating me badly, but to give her the opportunity to learn lessons about money and family that she should have learned decades earlier. Over the weekend, I developed a systematic plan for withdrawing my financial support from Ashley's life. It couldn't be sudden or dramatic because that would give her too much ammunition to paint me as the villain in whatever story she told her friends. Instead, it needed to be gradual enough to seem like natural changes in my own financial situation. I started by calling my financial advisor, Robert Chen, and scheduling a meeting to discuss restructuring my investments. I told him I was concerned about market volatility and wanted to move more of my assets into protected accounts that would be harder to access for large withdrawals. Robert was enthusiastic about the idea, explaining several investment options that would lock up my money for specific time periods while generating better returns than my current savings accounts. He helped me move nearly $400,000 into certificates of deposit and treasury bonds that couldn't be touched for months or years without significant penalties. This wasn't about earning more money. It was about creating legitimate reasons why I wouldn't be able to help Ashley with future financial emergencies. When she called asking for loans, I'd be able to honestly say that my money was tied up in investments and unavailable for immediate withdrawal. The next step was more delicate. I needed to establish a new normal in my relationship with Ashley that didn't revolve around her financial needs. I decided to start by changing the way I responded to her calls and visits. On Monday morning, Ashley called, just as I'd expected she would. She wanted to thank me again for Thanksgiving dinner and start planning the menu for next year. But she also had what she called a small favor to ask. Madison had been accepted to a winter break ski trip with her private school. But the cost was higher than Ashley had budgeted for. She needed $3,000 by the end of the week to secure Madison's spot, and she promised it would be the last time she asked for money until Derek's business picked up in the spring. I listened to the familiar routine of explanations and promises, but this time I heard it differently. Ashley wasn't asking for help with an emergency. She was informing me that I would be paying for Madison's ski trip, just like I'd paid for everything else that made her family's lifestyle possible. Instead of immediately agreeing like I always had before, I told Ashley I needed time to think about it, that my financial situation had become more complicated since Howard's death, and I couldn't make decisions about large expenses as quickly as I used to. Ashley sounded surprised, probably because I'd never hesitated to help her before. She asked what kind of complications I was dealing with, and I mentioned that my advisor had recommended moving my assets into longer-term investments for better security. I could hear the concern in Ashley's voice as she tried to understand what this might mean for her future access to my money. She asked several questions about my investment strategy, questions that revealed just how closely she'd been monitoring my financial capacity to support her lifestyle. Finally, Ashley suggested that maybe we should sit down together and go over my finances, so she could better understand what I could and couldn't afford to help with. She offered to bring Derek along since he worked in financial services and might have useful insights about protecting my assets. The suggestion was so transparent it was almost laughable. Ashley had never shown any interest in my financial well-being before, but the moment she sensed that her access to my money might be threatened, she suddenly wanted to be involved in managing my investments. I told her I'd think about it and let her know what I decided about Madison's ski trip. After I hung up, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Ashley's first instinct hadn't been to find another way to pay for her daughter's trip. It had been to figure out how to maintain her access to my bank account. That afternoon, I called Madison's school directly and asked to speak with someone about the ski trip Ashley had mentioned. What I learned confirmed that Ashley had been manipulating the situation in ways I'd never suspected. The ski trip was optional, not some exclusive opportunity that Madison would be devastated to miss. It was one of several winter break activities the school offered, and there were less expensive alternatives available. Ashley had specifically chosen the most expensive option and presented it to me as the only choice available. More importantly, the school told me that the payment deadline Ashley had mentioned was flexible. Parents could arrange payment plans or defer the cost until the following semester. There was no emergency requiring immediate payment of $3,000. I realized that Ashley had been using artificial urgency to pressure me into quick decisions about money, preventing me from asking questions or considering alternatives. She'd trained me to respond to her financial requests like they were genuine emergencies, when most of them were simply preferences she didn't want to pay for herself. That evening, I called Ashley back and told her I'd decided not to help with the ski trip. I explained that my investment restructuring meant I needed to be more careful about large expenditures, and that Madison would have to settle for one of the less expensive winter break options. Ashley's reaction was immediate and intense. She couldn't believe I was willing to disappoint Madison over a few $1,000s. She reminded me how much I'd spent on Connor's lacrosse camp, asking why I was suddenly treating Madison differently. When I pointed out that I'd never been repaid for Connor's camp, Ashley became defensive. She said she'd always intended to pay me back, but that Derek's business had been unpredictable. She promised that things were finally stabilizing and that she'd be able to start making payments on all the money she owed me. I listened to these promises knowing they were meaningless. Ashley had been making similar commitments for years, without any intention of following through. But this time, instead of accepting her reassurances, I asked her to put her repayment plan in writing. The request clearly caught Ashley off guard. She stammered that formal agreements weren't necessary between family members, that she was hurt. I didn't trust her word anymore, but I insisted that if she was serious about paying me back, she wouldn't mind documenting her intentions. Ashley said she needed time to work out the details with Derek, and that they'd put together a proposal for how they could start repaying their debts. She hung up sounding frustrated and confused, probably wondering what had changed about our usual financial arrangements. Over the next 2 weeks, I didn't hear from Ashley except for a few brief text messages about Madison being disappointed about the ski trip. No written repayment plan materialized, and Ashley seemed to be avoiding any conversations that might lead back to the subject of money. During this time, I continued working with Robert to restructure my finances in ways that would make it genuinely difficult for me to access large amounts of cash quickly. I also started documenting every financial transaction I'd made for Ashley's family over the years, creating a comprehensive record of exactly how much support I'd provided. The documentation process was eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. When I calculated not just the direct loans and gifts, but also the smaller expenses I'd covered regularly, the total amount was staggering. I'd been paying for birthday gifts, holiday presents, restaurant meals, and countless other incidental expenses that Ashley had simply stopped budgeting for. I realized that Ashley's financial dependence on me was even deeper than I'd initially understood. She hadn't just been borrowing money for major expenses. She'd been quietly shifting more and more of her family's routine costs onto my accounts, assuming I wouldn't notice or wouldn't object to picking up increasingly large portions of their living expenses. By early December, I felt ready to take the next step in my plan. I called Ashley and suggested we meet for lunch to discuss the financial situation she'd mentioned. I chose a restaurant where we could talk privately but wouldn't be interrupted by other family members. Ashley arrived looking more polished than usual, wearing a new dress that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. She ordered an expensive bottle of wine and spent the first 20 minutes talking about holiday plans and social events she was organizing. Finally, I steered the conversation toward the repayment plans she'd promised to develop. Ashley's demeanor shifted immediately. She became evasive, explaining that Derek had been too busy to sit down and work out specific numbers, but that they were both committed to finding a way to start paying me back. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, containing documentation of every loan and gift I'd made to her family over the past 5 years. When I slid the summary sheet across the table showing the total amount, Ashley's face went pale. She stared at the number for several seconds before looking back up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was the first time Ashley had been forced to confront the actual scope of how much money she'd taken from me, and the reality was apparently more than she'd been willing to acknowledge. I explained that I'd been working with a financial advisor to restructure my investments, and that going forward I wouldn't be able to provide the same level of financial support I'd been offering. I told her that any future loans would need to be formalized through proper documentation, with realistic repayment schedules and interest rates. Ashley tried to argue that formal loan agreements would change the nature of our relationship, making it feel like a business transaction instead of family support. But I explained that treating money casually had already changed our relationship in ways that weren't healthy for either of us. I told Ashley that I wanted to help her family transition to financial independence, and that the best way to do that was to stop enabling their dependence on my income. I offered to work with them on a gradual reduction of support over the next 6 months, giving them time to adjust their lifestyle to match Derek's actual earnings. Ashley became increasingly agitated as she realized I was serious about cutting off her access to my money. She accused me of punishing her family because I was unhappy about Thanksgiving, and she insisted that my support had never been charity but rather investment in my grandchildren's futures. I remained calm while she worked through her anger, but I didn't back down from the boundaries I was establishing. When Ashley finally realized that emotional manipulation wasn't going to change my mind, she tried a different approach. She started questioning whether I was making these financial decisions rationally, suggesting that grief over Howard's death might be affecting my judgment. She offered again to help me manage my investments, pointing out that Derek's expertise in financial services made him the obvious choice to protect my assets. The suggestion that I was mentally incompetent because I was finally refusing to bankroll her lifestyle was so insulting that I felt my own anger flare for the first time during our conversation. I told Ashley that my decision was based on careful analysis of our financial relationship, not emotional instability. I explained that I'd consulted with my attorney and financial advisor about the changes I was making, and that both professionals had supported my decision to establish clearer boundaries around money. I assured her that my mental faculties were perfectly intact, and that this was exactly the kind of decision a rational person would make in my situation. Ashley left that lunch looking shaken and angry, but I felt more confident than I had in years. For the first time since Howard's death, I'd stood up for myself in a situation that mattered, and I'd done it without losing my temper or saying anything I'd regret later. That evening, Derek called me at home. His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the stress underneath his professional tone. He said Ashley had told him about our lunch conversation, and he wanted to discuss some concerns he had about my financial planning decisions. Derek explained that he'd been in the insurance and financial services business for over 15 years, and that he was worried I might be making decisions based on bad advice from advisors who didn't understand my family situation. He offered to review my investment strategy and help me develop a more balanced approach to managing my assets. I listened to Derek's pitch without interrupting, recognizing that this was Ashley's second attempt to regain access to my financial decisions. When he finished his presentation, I thanked him for his concern but assured him that I was comfortable with the professional advice I was receiving. Derek pressed harder, suggesting that my current advisors might be taking advantage of my situation as a widow, steering me toward investments that generated higher fees for them rather than better returns for me. He painted a picture of financial predators who targeted elderly clients and positioned himself as the family member who could protect me from such exploitation. The irony was so obvious that I almost laughed. Derek was warning me about people who might take advantage of my money while simultaneously trying to maintain his own family's access to that same money. He was positioning himself as my protector while continuing to benefit from the financial dependence I was finally trying to break. I told Derek that I appreciated his concern, but that I was confident in my decision-making ability and satisfied with my current financial advisors. When he continued to push, I mentioned that Sarah Mitchell had explained my legal rights regarding family financial arrangements, and that I was comfortable with the boundaries I was establishing. The mention of my attorney seemed to catch Derek off guard. He asked why I'd felt the need to consult with a lawyer about family financial matters, and I explained that I wanted to understand the legal implications of the informal loan arrangements we'd been operating under. Derek's tone became more formal as he realized that I'd been taking professional advice about their financial dependence on me. He asked several questions about what my lawyer had told me, probably trying to assess whether I was planning any legal action to recover the money they'd already taken. I assured Derek that I wasn't interested in pursuing legal remedies for past loans, but that I wanted to establish clearer expectations for any future financial assistance. I explained that this was about protecting our family relationships by preventing money from becoming a source of ongoing conflict. By the time Derek hung up, he sounded resigned, rather than angry. I think he realized that Ashley's access to my bank account was genuinely ending, and that no amount of pressure or persuasion was going to change my mind. Over the next few days, I noticed that Ashley was posting less frequently on social media, and when she did post, the content was different. Instead of photos from expensive restaurants and shopping trips, she was sharing more modest activities and family moments that didn't involve spending money. I wondered if this meant she was already starting to adjust her lifestyle, or if she was simply being more careful about what she displayed publicly while she figured out how to replace my financial support. 3 weeks before Christmas, Ashley called with another financial request, but this time her approach was completely different. Instead of presenting an emergency that required immediate help, she asked if we could discuss the possibility of a small loan to help with holiday expenses. Ashley explained that she'd been working on a budget based on Derek's actual income, and that they were committed to living within their means going forward. She said they'd overextended themselves during the fall and needed help covering Christmas gifts for the kids, but that she had a specific plan for paying me back over the next 6 months. The change in Ashley's tone was remarkable. Instead of assuming I would automatically help, she was asking permission and offering concrete details about repayment. Instead of creating artificial urgency, she was giving me time to consider her request and make an informed decision. I told Ashley I'd think about it and get back to her within a few days. After we hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic that maybe the boundaries I'd established were actually starting to teach her better financial habits. But I also knew that this could be another manipulation. A new strategy designed to convince me that she'd learned her lesson, so I'd resume providing financial support. I needed to see sustained changes in Ashley's behavior before I could trust that her apparent growth was genuine rather than tactical. The real test would be what happened when I said no to her Christmas request. Would she accept my decision gracefully and find another solution, or would she revert to the emotional manipulation and family guilt that had worked so effectively in the past? Either way, I was prepared for her reaction. After months of feeling powerless and taken advantage of, I finally had control over my own financial decisions again. And whatever happened next, I wasn't going back to being Ashley's personal ATM. I decided to say no to Ashley's Christmas loan request, but I wanted to do it in a way that would demonstrate my commitment to the new boundaries I'd established. Instead of simply declining over the phone, I wrote her a letter explaining my decision and outlining what our financial relationship would look like going forward. In the letter, I acknowledged that she seemed to be making genuine efforts to change her approach to money, but explained that the best way I could support her family's financial independence was to stop providing external funding altogether. I told her that I believed she and Derek were capable of creating a sustainable budget based on their actual income, and that they'd never learn to do that as long as my money remained available as a backup plan. I also used the letter to address some of the emotional dynamics that had developed around money in our relationship. I explained that constantly being asked for loans had made me feel more like a bank than a mother, and that I wanted to rebuild our connection on a foundation that didn't involve financial transactions. Finally, I told Ashley that I loved her and wanted our family to have a wonderful Christmas, but that the gifts and celebrations would need to be funded through their own resources this year. I suggested that perhaps a more modest holiday focused on family time rather than expensive presents might actually be more meaningful for the children. I delivered the letter to Ashley's house on a Tuesday morning when I knew she'd be home alone. I didn't want Derek or the kids to be present when she read it because I suspected Ashley's initial reaction might be emotional, and I didn't want to create additional family drama. Ashley called me less than 2 hours after I left the letter, and she was angrier than I'd ever heard her. She accused me of deliberately sabotaging their Christmas, of caring more about proving a point than about my grandchildren's happiness. She said the timing was cruel, that cutting off support right before the holidays was designed to maximize their embarrassment and financial distress. I let Ashley vent her frustration without trying to defend myself or argue back. When she finally paused for breath, I simply repeated what I'd written in the letter about believing she was capable of handling the situation without my money. Ashley then shifted tactics, telling me that Derek's business had been promised several major contracts that would close in January, and that their financial problems were genuinely temporary. She said if I could just help them get through the holidays, they'd be able to start paying me back everything they owed by spring. The promises sounded exactly like dozens of similar commitments Ashley had made over the years, and I no longer had any faith that Derek's business prospects were as promising as she claimed. Even if the contracts were real, I'd learned that Ashley would always find new reasons why this month wasn't the right time to start repayments. I told Ashley that regardless of Derek's business situation, I wouldn't be providing any more loans or gifts. I explained that this decision wasn't temporary or conditional. It was a permanent change in how I managed my finances and my family relationships. Ashley hung up on me, and I didn't hear from her again for nearly 3 weeks. During that time, I wondered if I'd permanently damaged our relationship, if my refusal to continue funding her lifestyle had cost me access to my grandchildren. But I also felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Howard's death, I was making decisions based on my own needs and values, rather than someone else's expectations. I was finally acting like an independent person rather than a resource to be managed by my family. Christmas came and went quietly. I spent the day with Janet, who had flown in from Phoenix specifically to make sure I wouldn't be alone during what she knew was a difficult transition period. We cooked a simple dinner together and exchanged modest gifts, and I realized how much I'd missed having holidays that felt relaxed rather than performative. Ashley posted photos from their Christmas celebration on social media, and I was surprised to see that it looked warm and genuine, despite being clearly less expensive than previous years. The kids seemed happy with their gifts, which appeared to be thoughtful rather than extravagant, and the family photos had a natural quality that had been missing from their usual highly produced holiday presentations. Maybe Ashley was actually learning to find satisfaction in experiences that didn't require my financial support, or maybe she was just putting on a brave face while she figured out how to replace my contributions to their budget. Either way, I was relieved to see that my boundaries hadn't destroyed Christmas for my grandchildren. In early January, Derek called me with what he said was important news about their financial situation. He asked if he could come over to discuss some developments that might change everything about their ability to repay the money they owed me. I agreed to meet with Derek, curious about what new approach he and Ashley had devised to restore their access to my bank account. When he arrived at my house, he looked more serious than I'd ever seen him, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of formal business attire he usually reserved for important client meetings. Derek explained that he'd been working on a major insurance contract for a new commercial development project in the area, and that the deal had finally been finalized over the holidays. The commission would be substantial, he said, enough to completely change their family's financial picture. He opened his briefcase and pulled out what appeared to be official contracts and payment schedules, showing me documentation that seemed to support his claims about the business windfall. According to the paperwork, Derek was expecting to receive over $200,000 in commissions over the next 18 months. Derek proposed using this guaranteed income to formalize their debt to me, setting up a structured repayment plan that would return every penny they'd borrowed plus reasonable interest. He'd even prepared a written agreement outlining specific payment amounts and dates, complete with legal language that would make the arrangement enforceable. I examined the documents carefully, noting that they looked professionally prepared and seemed to address all the concerns I'd raised about informal loan arrangements. Derek had clearly invested significant time and effort into creating a proposal that would meet my requirements for financial accountability. But I also noticed some details that made me suspicious about the legitimacy of Derek's claims. The insurance contracts he showed me were dated very recently, yet he was presenting them as deals that had been in progress for months. The commission structure seemed unusually generous for the type of policies Derek typically sold. Most importantly, Derek's entire presentation felt like a sales pitch designed to convince me to resume lending money rather than a genuine attempt to repay existing debts. He spent more time talking about future borrowing opportunities than about addressing the money they'd already taken. I told Derek that I was pleased to hear about his business success, but that I wouldn't be entering into any new financial arrangements regardless of his improved income prospects. I explained that my decision to stop lending money to family members was based on principles that wouldn't change, even if their ability to repay improved. Derek seemed genuinely surprised by my response. He'd apparently expected that offering formal repayment terms would overcome my objections to continuing our financial relationship. He asked several times if I was sure I didn't want to reconsider, emphasizing how much money I was potentially leaving on the table by refusing to participate in their improved financial situation. The conversation revealed that Derek had fundamentally misunderstood why I'd cut off their access to my money. He thought my objections were about the lack of formal agreements and uncertain repayment terms. He didn't realize that I'd concluded our entire financial relationship was unhealthy, regardless of how it was structured. I explained to Derek that even if he could afford to repay everything they owed, accepting his money wouldn't repair the damage that had been done to my relationship with Ashley. The years of being treated like a personal bank had changed how I felt about our family dynamics, and formal loan agreements wouldn't address those underlying problems. Derek left looking frustrated and confused, probably because he'd invested considerable effort into developing what he thought was an irresistible proposal. I suspected that Ashley had convinced him that offering to formalize their debts would be enough to restore their access to my financial support. 2 days later, Ashley called and asked if she could come over to talk about Derek's visit. She sounded calmer than she had during our previous conversations, and I agreed to see her, hoping that maybe she was finally ready to discuss our relationship without focusing on money. When Ashley arrived, she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. The polished appearance she usually maintained seemed forced, and I noticed that her clothes, while still expensive, weren't as current as they usually were. She was clearly making an effort to maintain her image while adjusting to reduced financial resources. Ashley started by apologizing for hanging up on me before Christmas, acknowledging that she'd been angry and hadn't handled the situation well. She said she'd spent the past few weeks thinking about our relationship and trying to understand why I'd decided to change the way we handled family financial matters. I was encouraged by Ashley's more reflective tone, and I told her I appreciated her willingness to have a difficult conversation. I explained that my decision wasn't punishment for her behavior, but rather an attempt to restore balance to our relationship that had gradually become too focused on financial transactions. Ashley admitted that she'd become too comfortable relying on my support, and that she hadn't realized how much of their lifestyle was actually being funded by my contributions. She said that having to create a budget based solely on Derek's income had been a wake-up call about how far they'd drifted from financial reality. But then Ashley shifted the conversation in a direction I hadn't expected. Instead of asking me to reconsider my financial boundaries, she started questioning whether I was making other important decisions rationally. She expressed concern about my isolation since Howard's death, suggesting that I might be withdrawing from family relationships in ways that weren't healthy. Ashley pointed out that I'd been spending most of my time alone since cutting off contact with their family, and she worried that grief might be affecting my judgment about more than just money. She offered to help me find social activities or support groups that might help me process Howard's death more constructively. The suggestion that my financial decisions were symptoms of unhealthy grief processing was so patronizing that I felt my temper flare. Ashley was essentially arguing that any choice I made that didn't serve her interests must be evidence of mental instability or poor judgment. I told Ashley that I'd been happier and more at peace during the past few months than I'd been since Howard died, and that stepping back from our dysfunctional financial relationship had actually improved my emotional well-being. I explained that having control over my own money again had made me feel more confident and independent. Ashley seemed taken aback by my response, probably because she'd expected me to be defensive about her implications rather than confident about my choices. She tried to backtrack, claiming that she was only concerned about my welfare and wanted to make sure I wasn't isolating myself unnecessarily. But her attempt to frame my boundary setting as evidence of grief-related dysfunction revealed that Ashley still didn't understand the fundamental issues that had led to my decision. She was still looking for ways to characterize my choices as temporary problems that could be solved, rather than permanent changes that reflected my values. I realized during that conversation that Ashley might never fully accept responsibility for the way our relationship had become unbalanced around money. She might always see my refusal to continue funding her lifestyle as an overreaction, or a phase one was going through, rather than a reasonable response to years of being taken advantage of. That realization was actually liberating, because it freed me from the expectation that Ashley would eventually understand and validate my perspective. I could maintain my boundaries regardless of whether she agreed with them, and I could rebuild our relationship on terms that worked for me, rather than constantly trying to meet her expectations. After Ashley left that day, I felt more confident than ever that I'd made the right decision about cutting off financial support. Her attempt to pathologize my choices had actually confirmed that she still saw me primarily as a resource to be managed, rather than a person whose autonomy deserved respect. Over the following weeks, I started building a social life that didn't revolve around Ashley's family or their needs. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at a food bank downtown, and reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the years when so much of my emotional energy was focused on family financial crises. The volunteer work was particularly rewarding because it gave me a way to help people that felt meaningful rather than enabling. The families who came to the food bank were grateful for assistance and used it to supplement their own efforts to achieve stability. They weren't looking for someone to subsidize an unsustainable lifestyle. I also started traveling more, taking trips that I'd postponed for years because I was always worried about having enough money available for Ashley's emergencies. I visited Janet in Phoenix, took a cruise through the Caribbean, and even spent a week in Italy fulfilling a dream Howard and I had shared but never acted on. Each trip reinforced my decision to prioritize my own needs and interests, rather than constantly holding my resources in reserve for other people's crises. I was finally living like someone who owned her own life rather than someone whose primary role was supporting other people's choices. In March, nearly 4 months after I'd cut off Ashley's financial support, she called with news that surprised me. She'd gotten a part-time job working at an upscale boutique in Westfield Heights, and she wanted to share her excitement about earning her own money for the first time in years. Ashley sounded genuinely proud of her work, describing the customers and merchandise with enthusiasm I hadn't heard in her voice since she was much younger. She was learning about retail management and discovering that she had natural skills for sales and customer service. More importantly, Ashley seemed to be finding identity and purpose in work, rather than just in the lifestyle her family's income could support. She talked about her colleagues and the satisfaction of contributing to her family's budget through her own efforts, rather than external assistance. I was thrilled to hear about Ashley's job, both because it suggested she was adapting successfully to financial independence, and because it gave us something to talk about besides money. For the first time in months, we had a conversation that felt like the relationship between a mother and daughter rather than between a creditor and debtor. Ashley also mentioned that Derek's business was actually doing better, since he'd started focusing on clients he could serve effectively, rather than pursuing contracts that were beyond his capacity. Without the pressure of maintaining an artificially high lifestyle, he was able to operate more strategically and build sustainable relationships with customers. The family was living in a smaller house now, having sold the Westfield Heights property and moved to a more modest neighborhood that better matched Derek's actual income. Ashley said the kids had adjusted well to the change, and that family life felt more relaxed without the constant financial stress they'd been carrying. I was proud of Ashley for making these difficult adjustments without asking me for help or trying to manipulate me into resuming financial support. She was proving that my faith in her ability to handle independence had been justified, even if it had taken longer than I'd hoped for her to accept the challenge. Throughout the spring and summer, Ashley and I gradually rebuilt our relationship on a foundation that didn't involve money. We started having lunch together occasionally, and she began bringing the kids to visit me again, though these interactions felt different from our previous family gatherings. Madison and Connor seemed more mature and responsible than they'd been when their family was living beyond their means. They were learning to work for things they wanted rather than expecting those things to be provided automatically, and they seemed to appreciate experiences and possessions more because they understood their actual cost. Ashley never explicitly apologized for the years of financial dependence or acknowledged how her behavior had affected our relationship. But her actions demonstrated that she'd learned important lessons about money and family dynamics, even if she couldn't bring herself to discuss those lessons directly. I decided that I didn't need Ashley's verbal acknowledgement of what had happened between us. What mattered was that she was building a sustainable life for her family and treating me with respect, rather than seeing me as a source of funding for her lifestyle choices. By the fall, nearly a year after the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner that had catalyzed my decision to cut off financial support, Ashley suggested that maybe we could have a family gathering for the holidays again. But this time, she proposed that we make it a potluck where everyone contributed dishes and expenses were shared. I agreed to host Thanksgiving again, but with very different expectations than the previous year. Instead of taking responsibility for everything myself, I insisted that each family contribute specific dishes and help with setup and cleanup. Instead of being treated like hired help, I would be participating as an equal member of the family. The second Thanksgiving was completely different from the first. Ashley arrived early to help with preparations, bringing homemade side dishes and offering to handle tasks that would make the day easier for me. Madison and Connor set the table without being asked and helped serve dinner to everyone. Derek carved the turkey and led a toast, thanking me for hosting and acknowledging the effort that went into preparing the meal. Ashley's friends weren't invited this time. The gathering was limited to actual family members who had genuine relationships with each other. Most importantly, everyone stayed for the entire meal and helped clean up afterward. Instead of treating my house like a restaurant where they could eat and leave, Ashley's family participated in creating a shared experience that felt meaningful rather than transactional. After everyone went home that evening, I sat in my clean kitchen feeling satisfied in a way I hadn't experienced the previous year. The gathering had been smaller and less elaborate, but it had been authentic. I'd been treated like a family member rather than a service provider. I realized that cutting off Ashley's financial support had ultimately saved our relationship, rather than destroying it. By forcing her to develop independence and self-respect, I'd created the foundation for a connection based on mutual appreciation rather than financial dependence. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is refuse to enable their dysfunction, even when that refusal causes temporary pain and conflict. Ashley had become a stronger, more capable person because I'd stopped protecting her from the natural consequences of her financial choices. I also learned that I was much more resilient and independent than I'd given myself credit for. The months of standing up to family pressure and maintaining boundaries that served my interests had restored confidence I'd lost during the years of being treated like a personal bank. As I prepared for bed that Thanksgiving night, I felt grateful for the difficult lessons the previous year had taught me. I'd discovered that my value as a mother and grandmother didn't depend on my willingness to fund other people's lifestyle choices, and that real family relationships could only exist when they were built on mutual respect rather than financial transactions. The money I'd stopped lending to Ashley was still in my accounts, growing in investments that would provide security for my own future rather than subsidizing someone else's present. I was traveling more, enjoying hobbies I'd neglected, and building friendships that enriched my life in ways that purely transactional relationships never could. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what I needed and deserved, regardless of what other people expected from me. The woman who had sat alone at a table set for 12 was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't accept less than she deserved from the people she loved. Looking back on everything that had happened since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner, I realized that Ashley's treatment of me had actually been a gift, though not one she'd intended to give. Her selfishness and entitlement had forced me to examine our relationship honestly and make changes that ultimately benefited both of us. Ashley was now a more independent and capable person because she'd learned to live within her actual means, rather than relying on external support to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. I was happier and more confident because I'd reclaimed control over my own life and resources. The financial ruin I'd threatened to cook up for Ashley had turned out to be something closer to financial education. By withdrawing my support, I'd forced her to develop skills and perspectives that would serve her family well for the rest of their lives. And I'd learned that sometimes the most effective revenge against people who take advantage of your generosity is simply stopping being generous to them. The punishment fits the crime perfectly, and the results speak for themselves. The weeks following our second Thanksgiving brought unexpected developments that I hadn't anticipated. Ashley's transformation from entitled daughter to responsible adult was more complete than I had initially realized, and it began showing up in ways that went far beyond our family dynamics. In early December, Ashley called me with news that she'd been promoted to assistant manager at the boutique where she'd been working. Her supervisor had noticed her natural leadership abilities and customer service skills, and the promotion came with both increased responsibilities and a significant raise in pay. But what impressed me most wasn't the promotion itself, but how Ashley talked about it. She described the challenges of managing inventory, training new employees, and handling difficult customer situations with a maturity and enthusiasm I hadn't seen in her before. She was genuinely proud of achievements that she'd earned through her own efforts. Ashley also mentioned that she'd been taking business courses online in the evenings, studying retail management and small business operations. She had ideas about eventually opening her own boutique, and she was approaching that goal methodically, building the knowledge and experience she'd need to succeed rather than expecting someone else to fund her dreams. The change in Ashley's perspective was remarkable. Instead of seeing work as something beneath her social status, she'd discovered that earning her own success was more satisfying than living off borrowed money. She was building an identity based on her capabilities rather than her lifestyle. During one of our lunch meetings in December, Ashley brought up something that surprised me. She asked if I'd be willing to let her pay me back some of the money she'd borrowed over the years, not because she felt legally obligated, but because she wanted to close that chapter of our relationship properly. Ashley had calculated that with her new salary and Derek's stabilized business income, they could afford to send me $2,000 every few months until they'd repaid a significant portion of their debt. She wasn't promising to return everything immediately, but she wanted to demonstrate that she now understood the value of what I'd given them. I was touched by Ashley's offer, but I told her that I'd rather see her use that money to build emergency savings for her own family. I explained that the financial lessons she'd learned were worth more to me than recovering the loans, and that her independence was the only repayment I really wanted. Ashley insisted that making some payments would help her feel better about the relationship between us, and that she needed to take responsibility for the financial mistakes she'd made. We eventually agreed that she could make modest monthly payments if it was important to her, but that her family's financial security should always come first. The conversation revealed how much Ashley's relationship with money had matured. Instead of seeing my resources as an extension of her own budget, she now understood that borrowing money created real obligations that needed to be addressed. She was learning to distinguish between wants and needs, and to plan for the future rather than just managing immediate desires. Around the same time, I noticed that Madison and Connor were also developing healthier attitudes toward money and work. Madison had gotten a part-time job at a local coffee shop and was saving money for college expenses, rather than expecting those costs to be covered automatically. Connor was doing yard work for neighbors to earn money for sports equipment, instead of asking his parents to buy whatever he wanted. Both kids seemed more mature and responsible than they'd been when their family was living beyond their means. They were learning to appreciate things they worked for rather than taking expensive gifts for granted, and they seemed to understand that their family's financial stability depended on everyone making smart choices. I realized that my decision to cut off financial support had benefited my grandchildren almost as much as it had helped Ashley. They were developing work ethic and financial literacy that would serve them well throughout their lives, skills they never would have learned if I'd continued subsidizing their lifestyle. In January, Derek surprised me by stopping by my house unannounced to discuss something he said was important. When I invited him in, he seemed nervous but determined, like he'd been rehearsing whatever he wanted to say. Derek told me that he owed me an apology for the way he'd handled our family's financial situation over the years. He admitted that he'd known Ashley was borrowing money from me regularly, and that he'd been comfortable with the arrangement because it allowed their family to live better than his income alone could support. He said he'd never questioned where Ashley was getting the money for expenses that seemed beyond their budget, and that he'd chosen not to look too closely at our financial arrangements because they were convenient for him. Derek acknowledged that this had been selfish and irresponsible. Derek also explained that losing access to my financial support had actually improved his business performance. Without the safety net of Ashley's borrowing, he'd been forced to operate more efficiently and focus on clients who represented sustainable income, rather than chasing deals that were beyond his capacity to service properly. His insurance agency was now generating steady profits because he was working within realistic parameters, rather than trying to maintain the overhead required for an artificially high lifestyle. Derek had learned to build his business based on actual market conditions, rather than supplementing his income through family loans. I appreciated Derek's honesty about his role in our dysfunctional financial relationship. It would have been easy for him to blame everything on Ashley's spending habits, but he took responsibility for his own choices and acknowledged how the arrangement had affected everyone involved. Derek also told me something that explained a lot about Ashley's behavior during the period when I was cutting off support. He said she'd gone through several months of genuine panic about their financial future, during which she'd considered everything from moving back in with me to declaring bankruptcy. But eventually, Ashley had started researching their options and developing practical solutions rather than just looking for ways to restore access to my money. Derek said watching Ashley take charge of their financial crisis had been one of the factors that motivated him to improve his own business practices. The conversation with Derek helped me understand that Ashley's transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. She'd struggled with the adjustment to financial independence, and there had been moments when she'd considered desperate measures rather than accepting the need to change her lifestyle. But ultimately, Ashley had chosen to develop new skills and perspectives, rather than finding ways to avoid the consequences of her previous choices. Derek's account of her journey made me even more proud of the woman my daughter had become. In February, Ashley invited me to visit her new house for the first time since they'd moved out of the expensive Westfield Heights property. I was curious to see how they were living now that their lifestyle matched Derek's actual income. The house was smaller and older than their previous home, but Ashley had decorated it with style and creativity that made it feel warm and welcoming. She'd found furniture at consignment shops and estate sales, refinishing pieces herself to create a cohesive look that was both attractive and affordable. Madison and Connor each had their own bedrooms, and both kids had been involved in decorating their spaces with items they'd chosen and purchased with their own money. The house felt more like a home where people actually lived, rather than a showplace designed to impress visitors. Ashley gave me a tour with obvious pride, pointing out projects she'd completed herself and explaining how she'd managed to create an attractive living space on a limited budget. She'd learned skills I didn't know she possessed, and she was clearly enjoying the challenge of making her house beautiful without spending large amounts of money. The kitchen was particularly impressive because Ashley had taught herself to cook properly rather than relying on expensive takeout and restaurant meals. She showed me meal plans she'd developed to feed the family nutritiously while staying within their grocery budget, and she'd become quite skilled at preparing dishes from scratch. We had lunch together in Ashley's new kitchen, eating soup she'd made from ingredients she'd bought on sale and frozen bread she'd baked herself. The meal was delicious and satisfying in a way that our previous restaurant lunches had never been, perhaps because it represented Ashley's own capabilities rather than my financial resources. During lunch, Ashley told me about the financial planning she and Derek had been doing together. They'd created a realistic budget based on their actual income, established emergency savings, and even started contributing to retirement accounts for the first time in their marriage. Ashley was particularly proud of the college savings accounts they'd opened for Madison and Connor. The amounts they could contribute were modest, but Ashley said it felt important for the kids to know that their parents were planning for their futures, rather than expecting someone else to fund their education. The house visit convinced me that Ashley's family was not only surviving without my financial support, but actually thriving in ways they hadn't when they were living beyond their means. They seemed more relaxed, more connected to each other, and more optimistic about their future. In March, Ashley surprised me by asking if I'd be interested in going into business with her. not as a silent financial partner, but as an active collaborator in a venture that would combine her retail experience with my knowledge of antiques and home decorating. Ashley had been developing a plan to open a consignment shop specializing in home furnishings and vintage items. She'd researched the market, identified a suitable location, and created a business plan that outlined startup costs and projected revenues. But instead of asking me to fund the venture, Ashley was proposing that we work together as equal partners, each contributing different skills and resources to create something we could build together. She wanted my expertise in identifying valuable pieces and my connections in the local antique community. The proposal was completely different from Ashley's previous approaches to money and business. Instead of looking for someone to bankroll her ideas, she was offering to create value through her own efforts and inviting me to participate as a collaborator rather than a benefactor. I was intrigued by Ashley's business plan and impressed by the thoroughness of her research. She'd clearly learned a great deal about retail operations during her time at the boutique, and she understood the financial requirements of starting a small business. We spent several weeks discussing the details of Ashley's proposal, visiting the potential location, and meeting with other business owners in the area to better understand the market. Ashley handled these conversations professionally, asking informed questions and taking notes, rather than expecting me to manage the business aspects of the venture. Eventually, we decided to move forward with the consignment shop as a partnership. I would contribute my knowledge of antiques and provide some of the initial inventory from items I'd been storing in my house since Howard's death. Ashley would handle daily operations and bring her customer service skills to the business. We structured the partnership so that profits would be split equally, but Ashley would be responsible for the majority of the day-to-day work, since she had more time available. I would serve as a consultant and advisor, helping with buying decisions and sharing my knowledge of the antique market. The business planning process revealed how much Ashley had grown in her understanding of money and responsibility. She insisted on formal partnership agreements, detailed financial projections, and clear divisions of labor that would prevent misunderstandings about our respective roles. We opened Second Chances in May, operating out of a charming storefront in the historic district downtown. Ashley had chosen the name because it reflected both the nature of consignment retail and her own journey toward financial responsibility. The shop was an immediate success, partly because Ashley had developed excellent relationships with customers during her time at the boutique, and partly because we'd identified a genuine market need for high-quality used home furnishings at reasonable prices. Working with Ashley in the business gave me new insight into her capabilities and character. She was organized, creative, and genuinely cared about helping customers find pieces that would enhance their homes. She developed a talent for staging displays that showed furniture and accessories to their best advantage. More importantly, Ashley approached the business with integrity and dedication that I hadn't seen in her previous endeavors. She understood that our success depended on building trust with consignors and customers, and she worked hard to exceed expectations rather than just meeting minimum requirements. By the end of our first year in business together, Second Chances was generating enough profit to provide Ashley with income that supplemented Derek's earnings and contributed meaningfully to their family budget. She was proud of her success because it was based on her own efforts rather than external support. The business partnership also strengthened our personal relationship in ways I hadn't anticipated. Working together gave us shared goals and regular opportunities to collaborate on something meaningful. Our conversations shifted from being focused on family obligations to discussing business challenges and opportunities. I enjoyed having a project that engaged my knowledge and experience, while giving me a chance to work alongside Ashley as an equal partner. The shop became a place where we could build new memories together, rather than just managing the complications of our previous financial relationship. Looking back on the 2 years since that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I was amazed by how completely our family dynamics had transformed. Ashley had evolved from someone who saw me primarily as a source of funding into a capable business partner and responsible adult. The grandchildren had learned valuable lessons about work and money that would benefit them throughout their lives. Derek had developed a more sustainable approach to his business that generated steady income rather than relying on external support to maintain an unrealistic lifestyle. Most importantly, I had rediscovered my own strength and independence. The experience of setting boundaries and maintaining them despite family pressure had restored confidence I'd lost during the years of being treated like a personal bank. The money I'd stopped lending to Ashley was still growing in my investment accounts, providing security for my own future. But more valuable than the financial benefits was the knowledge that I could trust my own judgment about what I needed and deserved from the people in my life. The business partnership with Ashley had given us a way to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. We were both contributing value to something we'd created together, rather than operating in the unbalanced dynamic of giver and taker that had characterized our previous interactions. As I prepared to close the shop one evening in late November, almost exactly 2 years after the Thanksgiving that had changed everything, I reflected on how much had changed for our entire family. Ashley was locking up the register and organizing inventory for the next day, moving through the routine with the competence of someone who had found her calling. She looked up and smiled at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my daughter as she really was rather than as someone whose problems I needed to solve. She was a capable, intelligent woman who had learned to create success through her own efforts rather than depending on others to provide it for her. The transformation hadn't been easy for any of us, but it had been necessary. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their dysfunction, even when that refusal causes temporary pain and disruption. Ashley had needed to learn that she was capable of more than she'd believed, and I had needed to remember that my value as a mother wasn't measured by my willingness to fund other people's choices. The difficult lessons we'd both learned had ultimately made us stronger individually and brought us closer together as a family. As we walked to our cars together, Ashley mentioned that she was looking forward to hosting Thanksgiving at her house this year. She wanted to cook dinner for the family as a way of showing appreciation for everything we'd built together over the past 2 years. I smiled and told her I'd be honored to be her guest, knowing that this invitation came from a place of genuine affection rather than obligation or manipulation. We'd both learned the difference between relationships based on genuine connection and those based on financial transactions. The woman who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner alone 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. And the daughter who had taken that generosity for granted had become a partner I respected and admired. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, and teaching the people who've wronged you to live well too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.